We have been explaining to you that faith and obedience to the commands of Christ are identical. Let's briefly go back to the Garden of Paradise. When Adam and Eve fell, it was the free will that was corrupted. The mind was not corrupted at all. And so when Christ came, His commission to His apostles was to teach all my commands and how to do them. Because the intellect, the mind, had been kept intact, and so the mind can by its very self, even unaided by divine revelation, find out the commands of Christ and how to obey them. Of course, divine revelation was supposed to be a great help, but the mind, by itself, natural self, can attain the concept of one God. But notice that God did not force Adam and Eve to obey Him. He gave a command. The two of them understood the command, but God did not force them to obey them. And so the same thing happens with the Apostolic Commission when Christ told His apostles and their successors to preach my commandments, all my commandments, and how to obey them. That was directed to the mind. But they were not told to force their listeners to obey the commands. That is our role, whether we are going to obey it or not. You will notice that the words faith and obedience to the commands had been used in scriptures interchangeably, except that St. Paul gave more importance to the word faith, while Christ and the apostles gave more importance to obedience to the commands of Christ. And this is understandable because Paul was speaking to Gentiles. They were just beginning to learn, and so Paul mentioned the word man is saved by faith. Now, the reason St. Paul mentioned that is because he wanted man to be constantly face to face with his Creator. Because when a creature is constantly face to face with his Creator, the tendency is he begins to realize how far he is from the Creator. And the more he meditates, the farther the Creator becomes and the lower he becomes. You know, when you think that you are so near your Creator or so near God, there is something wrong with your thinking. Because if your thinking is right, the gap becomes bigger and bigger as you meditate on God. Until you come to a point that you find yourself so unworthy and so unacceptable to the Creator. Now, when you feel this, then you are thinking correctly, because only when you find yourself unacceptable to the Creator that He begins to accept you. It is when you feel yourself unacceptable, and this is called the virtue of humility, that He exalts you and bring you to Him. And why did the apostles and Christ emphasize obedience to the commands of Christ instead of faith? Because they were afraid that if you sit down at the foot of Christ studying the commands, you might never stand up and obey the commands of Christ, when the obedience is of the utmost importance. So you see here, the Catholic faith consists in both, that you sit down at the foot of Christ, learn His commandments, and how to obey them, then getting up and obeying those commands. That is a whole Catholic faith. If you just sit down and learn the commands of Christ and how to do them, but do not stand up to obey them, you even become guilty of the commands that you have learned. It is like some of those old women who goes to Mass every day and then forget their duties to their maids, their drivers, and their children and their husband. You see, it's all sort of listening to Christ, but there is no obedience to the commands of Christ. It has to be both. On the other hand, if you don't sit down at the foot of Christ and just obey the commands, when you have not learned how to obey them, you will end up doing it the way you want instead of how Christ wants it. You will end up doing your own will instead of the will of Christ. Let's take the example of Martin Luther. You see, Martin Luther was obeying the commands of Christ. He was an Augustinian, and St. Augustine is one of the fathers of the church, so he knew exactly what to do. Besides, he was trained probably in the Augustinian way, and he knew exactly how to obey the commands of Christ. So he was trying to find out all his sins. Now that is obedience to the commands of Christ. You have to find out all your sins, to be repentant for your sins. When he went to confession, like I mentioned before, for 6 hours, he wanted to make sure he had confessed all his sins. That is also a command of Christ. You must confess all your sins. Except that Martin Luther, as he was doing this, was so afraid of the justice of God. He was doing it because he feared the justice of God, which is correct. Except he forgot the mercy of God. So when Martin Luther was there meditating on the justice of God, this depressed him. And it will surely depress anybody if you just think of the justice of God, because your concept of God is wrong, or the concept of Christ is wrong. Justice and mercy go hand in hand together. And so when his superior reminded him that Christ is merciful, that Christ mercifully forgives all sin, he swung to the other side completely. That his mind was completely in the mercy of God or Christ, and he forgot the justice of God. And this was his defect, that at the beginning he was only obeying the commands. When it depressed him, he was now just meditating on Christ, but without obeying the commands of Christ. And that can happen to us. And it's happening to all Catholics today. In fact, not only do we disobey the commands of Christ, we don't even know what are the commands of Christ. At the beginning, we mentioned the fact that in the Garden of Paradise, it was man's free will that was corrupted, but the mind was left intact. It can discover supernatural truths, the concept of a true God, very effectively. Now let us go back to this mind, this reasoning that is so important to man. Among Christians, we have to use our reasoning. And the first thing that reason tells us is that the religion of Christ, Christianity, is a revealed religion. It was revealed to us by a God-made man, and it was entrusted to a group of men, the apostles, and afterwards their successors, entrusted to them. Now, after John, all Christians will admit and accept that revelation was closed, meaning to say, there are no more revelations after John. That's the reason why in the Catholic Church we are not very enthusiastic about private revelations, because we are sure there can never be a new revelation. So what is important is we go back to those who are entrusted to keep the divine revelation. Those entrusted. That's the reason why when you hear Christian preaching, you have to find out where they got it. If they got it only from their own, then there is something wrong with it. It has been revealed. Our religion has been revealed. It has been kept by a group of men who are all saints. So we have to go back to the keepers of revelation. And the first thing that we should do is sit down and try to meditate on those revealed truths. And the first thing you will discover is that we had misunderstood these truths all along. That we have developed wrong concepts about this truth. And then this luminous truth will come to us one by one. Very simple, but complete. Simple and complete. And so you will discover that there is nothing that you can add because it is complete. And there is nothing that you can take away because it is going to be incomplete. And so for us Catholics, this is the Catholic faith. We must know the commands of Christ, how to do them, and obey them. If we do not obey the commandments of Christ, then we have a Catholic Church, but without a Catholic faith. God bless you.